In this lecture from Module 7, we're going to take a look at change, not just constitutional change, which we'll see in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but also we'll look at social changes, political changes, and economic changes that occur in the South and the nation as a whole in the aftermath of the Civil War. Throughout this whole Civil War era, power struggles had been characteristic of relationships between the military and the three branches of government during the Civil War. If you take a look at Table 10.1 on pages 236 and 237, you'll see how some of these power struggle issues were evolving. And then in the aftermath of the Civil War, if you take a look at the chart, take a look at Table 11.1 on pages 260 and 261, you'll see an additional set of struggles that are emerging between Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court in the aftermath of the Civil War and in the Reconstruction period. This is also a period of power struggles between state and federal governments. We will look at issues like the Black Codes in the southern states, the readmission to Congress of representatives and senators from the southern states, and the military Reconstruction Acts that will shape Reconstruction from 1866 to the end of the period in 1877. We'll also look at, this is also a period of power struggles between blacks and whites, as blacks construct lives as free, not enslaved people, and the economic and the social and political implications of this, but also as whites attempt to reconstruct their lives in a society that is no longer based socially, economically, or politically on black slavery. Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April the 9th of 1865. A few weeks after this, also in April of 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated. In February of 1865, Congress had passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which was declared ratified on December 18th of 1865. This amendment effectively ends slavery in the United States. It says, first of all, in Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Note that exception, as a punishment for a crime. So due process of law, on some basic level, what this would provide is the idea that a person who is in prison can be held in a form of involuntary servitude. But generally speaking, this slavery cannot exist in this country. Notice also that there's no mention of voting or citizenship rights for the formerly enslaved. The amendment also included a second section in which states that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. This is significant because this is the first time Congress is given enforcement powers under the Constitution. No other provision or amendment to the Constitution granted Congress this power. So what it says effectively is that the federal government has the power to enforce the 13th Amendment throughout the nation as a whole. In 1883, the Supreme Court cases in 1883, Congress was given the power to remove what were considered badges and incidents of slavery. But what also happens by the end of the 19th century is that you see a narrowing of the interpretation of what these badges and incidents of slavery are. This did not include private discrimination. Emancipation, or the end to slavery, actually had come throughout the country in a series of measures. If you remember, we talked about the first emancipation that was occurring in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. So on this map, you could count in that first emancipation period all of those states of the Northeast, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, that are passing either gradual or immediate emancipation laws in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. Then you've got another series of areas that on this map are outlined in white, areas that are carved out of the old Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which prohibited the expansion of slavery into the territories west of the Appalachian Mountains and north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River. Then you've got emancipation that comes in 1848 as a part of the Oregon Act, which outlawed slavery in Oregon, Washington, and those areas, and those territories. Congress had freed slaves in the territories, the Indian territories, Nebraska, the territories under which it had control in 1862. And then finally, you've got the end of slavery with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. So you have a series of legislations, a series of acts, which effectively end slavery in the nation as a whole. Now, what's going to happen in the aftermath of the end of slavery in the post-Civil War period? Well, as we mentioned earlier, the abolitionists actually had no plans as to how emancipation would be put into place, how it would be put into effect throughout the country. Their goal had been simply to end slavery. But most people knew that with the end of slavery, there would have to be some kind of economic security, some provisions for economic security and protections of freedom for the newly emancipated. They would have to be moved towards some level of self-sufficiency. So even before the Civil War ends, you have efforts or suggestions on the part of some as to what form these efforts of this movement toward self-sufficiency would take. In 1862, you have what many described as the Port Royal experiment, in which freed people near Port Royal on the Sea Islands off of the South Carolina coast, the freed people would be allowed to remain on abandoned plantations and farm the land for a share of the profits. The government would send in, or did send in, agricultural supervisors to work with freed people. And societies, aid societies, or missionary aid societies like the American Missionary Association, provided teachers. Many of these teachers were white women whose presence was actually preferred as a way of providing models of morality for the formerly enslaved. In another effort in 1864, you have the military under Sherman handing down Sherman's Field Order number 15. This set aside parcels of land for freed people. And it does become the basis of this idea that the government would provide 40 acres and a mule, because in addition to the parcels of land, the 40-acre parcels of land, the Army, obviously, by 1864 and in 1865, had thousands of mules that it would no longer need, the Union Army, and thousands of mules that they had used during the war to help transport goods from one place to another. And the idea was that, coupled with the 40 acres that would be provided from this large amount of land that had been confiscated by the federal government, you would also include the presence of a mule, a way to get the formerly enslaved, people who had been agricultural workers, to give them kind of a leg up in becoming self-sufficient. Families were, the model of this was that families would work together, but what people also began to see was that Black women were not working on the fields and in the fields in the same way that they had done as slaves. And what this seemed to indicate was that families actually wanted more control over women's labor, that they wanted to remove women from the kind of labor that they had considered detrimental to family life. They wanted to model their families more on the white families that they had worked for. In 1866, Congress passed the Southern Homestead Acts, which made thousands of acres of public lands in the South available to homesteaders under a process that was similar to what was happening with homesteading in the West. This government land the government eventually resettled about 30,000 blacks and whites on this public land on 80-acre plots of land. But what should also be taken into consideration is that much of the really good agricultural farmland in the South had already been claimed and purchased. So the government land that is there to be redistributed, in a sense, is mostly of poor quality. This is not confiscated plantation land. This is government land, what is left over after the land, good profitable land, the rich farmland, had been sold. In terms of this economic process that's taking place, as Southern states try to resolve issues of what would Black freedom look like economically, socially in the South, never politically, because again, even with the 13th Amendment, there was no provision for political involvement, no provision for voting or equality or citizenship included in the 13th Amendment. And the nation as a whole is actually still operating under the old Supreme Court decision, the Dred Scott decision, which had denied citizenship rights to freed people. So citizenship is not at question here. It is a question, it is the issue of just simply freedom and what is freedom going to look like. In 1866, Southern states were re-electing state and local officials. Many of these officials on the state, local, and eventually on the national level were former Confederates. State legislatures passed black codes in 1865 and 1866 as a means of controlling black populations. In general, these laws prohibited blacks from testifying against whites, outlawed intermarriage between blacks and whites, denied suffrage or the right to vote, provided for curfews on blacks in urban areas, put limits on black land ownership, and punished severely vagrancy. Black codes did not provide blacks with political and legal rights that were associated with citizenship. The black codes were designed to ensure the availability of a subservient agricultural labor supply that could be controlled by white people. They imposed severe restrictions on freed people, men and women, but they did allow for some legalization or some of the privileges that blacks had not enjoyed during slavery. For example, legalization of marriages, allowing blacks to enter into contracts, to buy property, to sue or to testify in the courts. Now, on the other hand, as a negative, what they did not provide for, or what they did allow, was that if you think in terms of the contracts, blacks could enter labor contracts, and it was expected that they would enter annual labor contracts with white landowners. Black children and young people between the ages of 2 and 21 could be apprenticed to white people in the same systems of apprenticeship that had existed for free black children before the Civil War, sometimes very abusive apprenticeships. The black codes legalized corporal punishment. Whippings and other forms of corporal punishments became legal under these codes. And the black codes provided very severe restrictions on loitering and vagrancy, prohibited the use or the possession of alcohol or firearms, and restricted hunting, fishing, and grazing of livestock. So these were some very restrictive measures. And what you see here are people essentially trying to work out exactly what would be the parameters of freedom. What kinds of things would freed people, freed blacks in the South, be allowed to do, but what kind of things would they be restricted from doing? In the aftermath of the Civil War, or during the Civil War and afterward, hundreds of thousands of freed people had migrated to southern cities. And these new free black urban populations provided a different dimension to what's happening, especially in the Deep South. African American populations in cities like Atlanta, Nashville, and Memphis skyrocketed between 1861 and 1900. Memphis, for example, went from a black population that was about 3,500 in 1860, or about 17% of the total population, to nearly 16,000 blacks by 1866. However, the city life did not always offer solutions for the problems of recently emancipated blacks. As one woman, Liney Chambers, remembered decades later, in describing what had taken place during this period, she said, quote, "Times was awfully unsettled for a long time. People what went to the cities died. Seemed like they thought if they be free, they never have no work to do and just have plenty to eat and wear. They found different, and when it was cold, they had no wood like they'd been used to. The war didn't make times much better for a long time. Some of them had a worse time. So many soon got sick and died. They died of consumption and fevers and nearly froze. Some near about starved. The colored folks just scattered about, hunting for work after the war." Now, what Chambers is alluding to is something that we see happening throughout the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. And that is that in trying to define what freedom would mean for them, many freed people just simply exercised their freedom of mobility. They moved away from the plantations that they had worked on and lived on. Some of them just simply moving down the road to a different plantation. So they're remaining within the agricultural sector, but not on the plantation that they had, where they had been enslaved. Others, on the other hand, moved away from the plantation and to the cities. Freedom also meant for Black people changing their names to reflect the new status. So Lonnie Smith now became Liney Chambers. It meant legalizing marriages and their families. It meant economic life. So that's why this whole thing of what's going to happen in terms of the Black codes and the restrictions on economic activity becomes so important. It meant trying to figure out how you could become economically self-sufficient with limited skills, with skills that went that did not go much further than the agricultural skills that you had been able to exercise on a plantation. As another freed woman, Patsy Moore, pointed out, quote, "When freedom come, folks left home, out in the streets, crying, praying, singing, shouting, yelling, and knocking down everything. Then come the calm. It was sad then. So many folks done died. Things tore up, and nowheres to go, and nothing to eat, and nothing to do. Times got hard. We went to the wash tub. Only way we could earn a living." Now, the reference to going into the quote, the reference to going to the wash tub applies to one of the principal ways in which Black women were able to earn a living in these urban areas. In this sketch, for example, you see the picture of the woman carrying the wash out to hang on the lines in her backyard. She's not just washing for her family. In all probability, this is how she's earning a living. So Black people in urban areas had come to the cities expecting that life would be different, but what they discover is that they still have the problems of earning a living in these urban communities, and they're forced, for the most part, they're forced back to doing the same kinds of labor that they had done on the plantations. So in many cases, Blacks who had migrated to the cities immediately after the Civil War, some of them returned to the agricultural areas, returned to the fields and farm labor within a few years. But one of the most important developments that occurs during the Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, as far as Blacks are concerned, has to do with education. As one observer noted, education is what makes a man free and also makes a woman free. And that's the education, or development of schools, was one of the most positive and long-lasting accomplishments of Reconstruction. Schools were established by the Freedmen's Bureau and by the missionary aid societies, like the American Missionary Association. Black churches also ran their own schools, and even some private individuals operated schoolhouses or schoolrooms, not much bigger in some cases than the cabins in which they lived. There was a strong desire to learn on the part of Black men, women, and children. They sometimes worked all day in the fields and then went to school at night. On the whole, about 3,000 schools were established during the Reconstruction period, schools that educated over 150,000 students. Initially, as I mentioned earlier, most of the teachers were white missionaries. Aid societies preferred northern white women and brought these northern white women into Black communities. But you also saw, on some occasions, Black women, northern free Black women, who came with the missionary aid societies into communities. For example, Charlotte Forten, who was from the very wealthy, prosperous free Black family, James Forten family, was one of the women, free Black women, who went into South Carolina to educate recently emancipated slaves. Northern religious organizations and churches also established Black colleges and universities. Most of these offered elementary and secondary education and progress to the higher levels. For example, if we looked at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, it started out as a school that was primarily just simply for people who were being educated on the very basic levels. But then increasingly, they began to add more and more classes and higher levels, and most importantly, to train teachers who would then go back into their communities to educate the recently emancipated. Howard University, on the other hand, was established by the Freedmen's Bureau, so the pattern is a little bit different. Howard University in Washington, D.C. Was established during the same time, but by the Freedmen's Bureau, or in effect by the federal government. So colleges and universities, historically Black colleges and universities that are created during this period, are created either by the missionary aid societies, by the Freedmen's Bureau, or in some cases by private individuals. Another development during this period is the creation of the Freedmen's Savings Bank. Although the name suggested a connection with the government's programs for the freed people, and sometimes the Freedmen's Savings Bank shared offices with the Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen's Savings Bank was a private bank, a private institution, not a federally created institution or chartered institution. It was chartered by the federal government in 1865, but it is a private bank. It started out as a simple savings institution for, but not limited to, former slaves and their descendants. Eventually, there were some freed Blacks, antebellum freed Blacks, who deposited their savings into this Freedmen's Savings Bank. The first branches were located in cities and towns where Black soldiers were mustering out or where thousands of Blacks had migrated. Towns like Memphis. Memphis had a branch of the Freedmen's Savings Bank. The signature books of the bank, which have been microfilmed by the National Archives and are available in local libraries like the Memphis Public Library, are a very rich source of history of African American families. The bank's tellers recorded information about each depositor, things like the name and physical descriptions, the color of the skin, the person's height, any kind of distinguishing marks, the place of birth, place that they spent their childhood, their occupations at the time that they opened their account, their residence at the time that they opened their account, and also when they arrived in the cities. The names of their children, the names of their brothers and sisters, sometimes remarks on where these family members were For the early depositors, they also included the names of the former slaves or the freed persons' owners and the plantations where they were raised or where they resided, the owners resided. And for over a period of time, they also included death certificates in the files of the depositors. And occasionally you had, as you see in this picture, a bank book for an individual, which gives us a very, very interesting look at the savings histories of some individuals or some organizations, black organizations, that were depositors in the Freedmen's Savings Bank. The Freedmen's Savings Bank, initially, the first branches were located in New York, then moved. The bank's headquarters were in Washington, and then were initially in New York and then moved to Washington in 1867. Between 1865 and 1871, the bank opened 37 branches in 17 states and the District of Columbia. There were over 70,000 depositors, most of them African Americans. And the deposits total approximately $57 million. At first, it was only a savings institution, something like, I guess I would characterize as a giant piggy bank. But in 1870, Freedmen's Savings Bank instituted a loan and investment policy. By early 1874, however, the bank's resources were overwhelmed by the effects of this policy. They were lending out too much money, lending out money that on some very risky loans. You also had a national economic panic in 1873, and the bank had overexpanded, and there was mismanagement and abuse and fraud. Might sound a little bit like what we have today with the recent banking crisis of a year ago. When the bank was at the point of collapse, on the brink of collapse, the officers of the bank elected Frederick Douglass as its president, and Douglass invested $10,000 of his own money to demonstrate his faith in the bank's future. However, he quickly realized that he was, as he described it, quote, married to a corpse. And he recommended that Congress close the Freedmen's Bank, which it did in 1874. And when this happened, thousands of African Americans lost their life savings, which they could, some of them, about half of them, did recover at least a portion of it, but many of them did not. What they also lost was a faith in banking, in banks as a whole. You see people who were just willing from after this to just keep their money in their mattresses because they did not trust banks. So it takes many, many decades before you have this reversal in terms of the savings patterns of African Americans. The Freedmen's Savings Bank and what happened with the bank left a really bitter taste in the mouths of many freed people. Another thing that we see happening during this period, though, is something that leaves an even greater bitter taste in the lives of freed people, and that is a growing violence against freed people. The Black Codes, as I mentioned earlier, had allowed corporal punishment of freed people for things like vagrancy or attempting to vote, although attempting to vote in some cases could result in just the death of a black person. And Reconstruction policies in general were aimed at controlling blacks politically, economically, and socially by whatever means people was thought to be most effective. White social clubs like the Knights of the White Camellia and the Ku Klux Klan were organized for this purpose. The KKK was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866, originally, like the Knights of the White Camellia, as a social club for Confederate veterans. However, it also had secret rituals and secret oaths. One of the key figures in the Klan's rapid growth and one of its founders was former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. But on the whole, the members of the Klan came from all classes of white society. The Klan and other terroristic organizations functioned mainly where Black people were a large minority, but where their votes could affect the outcome of elections. Terrorist mobs also beat and killed hundreds of Black people and many white people who were sympathetic toward them. Black churches and schools were burned. Churches and schools in urban areas in particular were burned. And Republican Party leaders, white Republican Party leaders, were threatened and often killed. White mobs were also active in attacks on Black communities, Black urban communities, during this early Reconstruction period. And two very good examples of this are what we see happening in Memphis in 1866, in the Memphis Riot of 1866. And New Orleans, also, there's a riot in New Orleans in 1866. The Memphis riot occurred in late spring. The New Orleans riot occurred in the same summer. In Memphis, the riot began on May 1st of 1866 with the confrontation between local police and Black soldiers who were housed at Fort Pickering as they were mustering out of the military. So you had large contingents of Black soldiers in this fort on the banks of the Mississippi River. You had a pretty sizable Black community by 1866. The riot lasted for 3 days, and in the aftermath of the riot, as a part of the riot, a result of the riot, 46 Black men and women were killed. 2 white men were killed. 75 Black people were wounded. At least 5 Black women were raped. That was a significant figure because in this case, and throughout the South, rape is being used as an act of violence and intimidation. So it falls into the pattern of all the other things that are happening to try to control the actions of Black people or to strike fear in Black people. There were numerous robberies, and every Black church and school was burned. White teachers in these schools were sent out of town for their own safety, although some of them later returned to reestablish the city's Black educational system. The 14th Amendment was also passed during this period. And we'll stop at this point and come back to the 14th Amendment in just a minute. The 14th Amendment defined both national and state citizenship. If you turn to the Constitution in the back of your textbook, we'll take just a quick look at it. It was passed in response to the Black Codes, and before it was passed, what you had happening was growing violence in the South, passage of the Black Codes. Congress tried to remedy this by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which would become the basis of this 14th Amendment. Okay, now giving you a chance to just kind of take a look at it. What's in this amendment? Well, the amendment provides a guarantee of the rights of Blacks as citizens. It creates a national and a state citizenship and guarantees citizenship to every person who is born in the U.S. It makes every person a citizen of the state in which they are born. And it defines certain specific rights of citizens and protects these against the power of the federal government. You also have provisions that these rights cannot be abridged except through due process of law. What you don't have in here is the provision for the recognition of the rights of women as citizens. Women are granted or considered citizens because of this reference in the first section of the Constitution to citizenship rights that are guaranteed to every person. But in the second section, you note on 3 occasions in that second section a reference to adult males that you can have a reduction in the representation, a state's representation in Congress if adult males are not permitted to vote. So this provides or sets up what will become a growing conflict between advocates of women's suffrage, many of whom had been very supportive of the abolitionists and been very supportive of the Union during the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. But with the 14th Amendment, what they began to see is that suffrage is going to be restricted and will be allowed only to men, black and white. In 1870, the 15th Amendment is ratified and put in the Constitution, and it provides that the right to vote cannot be denied or abridged by the U.S. or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Does not include the word sex, which would have resolved the issue of suffrage for men and women in the nation as a whole. It also gives, again, Congress this power to enforce with appropriate legislation. And that was something that, if you look at the 14th Amendment again, was also included in the 14th Amendment. Now, this 15th Amendment widened this rift between advocates of suffrage for women and suffrage, the right to vote for men. There were some on black and white on one side who supported not just the right to vote for blacks, but the right to vote for women. People like Sojourner Truth felt that the amendment should be broad enough to include women as well as men. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, mid-19th century advocates of women's suffrage and women's rights, felt that this was the time that women should be included. The right to vote for women should be included. On the other hand, some early advocates like Lucy Stone and Frederick Douglass felt that this was, as they pointed, that there should be a black men first policy, that black suffrage was more important at this time than women's suffrage. People like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a black woman, and Harriet Purvis, also a black woman, were initially supporters of women's suffrage, and they could see that this should have been a time when women's suffrage should have been accomplished. But they also leaned toward this policy of black men, of the importance of black men getting the right to vote at this stage. And some even recognized that this nation was not really ready to entertain this broader reform movement that would have included blacks and women, and that if they pushed too hard for the inclusion of both blacks and women, then they might not get either one. So as a result of this, the 15th Amendment passes in 1870, and it's another 50 years, not until 1920, with the 19th Amendment, that women get the right to vote. Now, as far as political changes that occurred during this period, and this is pushing back even before the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment, blacks participated in meetings, organizations, and conventions even before the end of the Civil War. In these forums, they voiced their political concerns. The National Equal Rights League was organized in 1864, and the group supported black male suffrage and other civil rights, and included, those who had been strong advocates for women's suffrage. Union leagues were also organized. The league held meetings, some of them segregated, and segregated in the sense of being for blacks only. Others integrated meetings of blacks and whites, with some women also attending these. And these meetings supported demands for black rights. The convention movement that had existed before the Civil War and had been a forum where black men could advance their ideas of political and economic issues continued after the Civil War. And in these post-Civil War conventions, they pushed for things like the right to serve on juries, or demands for educational opportunities, and for the right to carry guns, something that had been restricted by some of the black codes in the South. Conventions also protested restrictions on freedom. The conventions, however, were dominated by antebellum free blacks, and convention petitions that came out of these conventions and appeals from the conventions were generally ignored. Now, what this seemed to indicate, or what this does indicate, is that there is this not widening, but there is a gap that was existing between antebellum free blacks and those who gained their freedom with the Civil War. And it would be a very significant issue as we move into the later Reconstruction period. Although, let me back up, not really as significant, because increasingly the kind of repression that you're going to see on blacks as a whole will galvanize them and bring them together as a group. And increasingly those, the elements or the numbers, the small numbers of antebellum free blacks will be just kind of absorbed into this wider black community. In 1877, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, another Civil Rights Act. They had passed one initially in 1866 in the aftermath of revelations about the actions of the black codes, the significance of the black codes, and the growing violence against blacks in the South. And that had been put into the Constitution as the 14th Amendment. Then you've got the 14th and 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment passed in 1870. And in 1875, they passed another Civil Rights Act, which provides for the most sweeping civil rights legislation of the century. It called for full and equal enjoyment of all of the rights of citizenship, prohibited racial discrimination in public facilities, on conveyances, in other words, not buses, but streetcars and trains, in theaters, and in other areas of public interaction. However, despite the sweeping nature of the Civil Rights Bill, there was very little effort to enforce it. And in 1877, we're going to have the end of political Reconstruction. By 1883, the Supreme Court will rule that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was virtually unconstitutional. Now let's take a quick look at economic changes that developed. 40 acres and a mule was not forthcoming. Despite the efforts of things like the Port Royal experiment, Sherman's Field Order Number 15, the Southern Homestead Acts, African Americans still found it difficult to get a leg up in this agricultural society. And even though if we look today, you still see people who are asking, well, what happened to the 40 acres and a mule? It was never really handed down as an obligation of the federal government. It's not going to be in something like the 14th Amendment or the 15th Amendment. This was just seen as a possible way in which Reconstruction could take place, and it's never implemented. Instead, blacks are left to kind of flounder around for the first 10 years and blacks and whites, to try to figure out what would be the nature of black labor and a free market economy in the aftermath of the Civil War. What form will it take? Initially, blacks signed contracts that put them back into the same kind of labor arrangements in many cases that they had known as slaves. They found themselves working as gangs or in gangs as they had done in slavery. They tried to restrict the labor of women or put gain some kind of control over the labor of the women in their households. By the 1870s, you have the emergence of a different labor arrangement in terms of sharecropping and tenant farming. There were some suggestions of these labor arrangements, even as far back as the Port Royal experiment. However, this idea of sharecropping really takes hold in the South in the 1870s. Sharecropping was a system where workers were paid a percentage of the crop they produced. But it could be a way in which blacks could find some measure or some space to gather together enough resources to purchase their own land, which was the goal of many blacks in the late 19th century. but it also was a way in which blacks could be cheated. Tenant farming and sharecropping offered autonomy and economic opportunity, but in the end, these arrangements locked poor blacks and poor whites into perpetual poverty and debt. Sharecroppers received about a quarter to half of the crop for their labor, but landowners deducted the cost of fuel, seed, sometimes food, housing, deducted this from the sharecroppers' earnings before they paid them. And remember that it is the landowner who is taking the crop to market. It's not the sharecropper. It's not the actual farm labor. What the sharecropper provides is his labor or her labor. And what the landowner provides is everything else. Tenant farming allowed a little more space because this is a system where you're renting the land from a person. But again, there's all kinds of opportunities for abuse even with that system. By the 1890s, about 84% of black workers in the country as a whole are still in the agricultural system, are still domestic labor, in the domestic labor forces. About another 16% worked in sawmills or mines, and a very small percentage were skilled laborers or professionals. At the end of the Civil War, however, at least one-half of all the skilled craftsmen in the South were black. By the 1890s, blacks were no more than 10% of the skilled labor force. So if you look at this, what you begin to see is that blacks are being locked into an economic arrangement, an economic system, where they will still be providing the labor in the agricultural sector. A process of de-skilling that we had seen for free blacks before the Civil War is continuing for freed blacks in the aftermath of the Civil War. And even land ownership becomes a greater problem. By 1950, even blacks who had managed to purchase land in the aftermath of the Civil War are losing it in increasing numbers. Only about 15 million acres, blacks owned only about 15 million acres out of the country's 1 billion acres of arable land. And over the period of the 20th century, black farmers have lost increasing amounts of the land that they gained. For many blacks, this whole question of land ownership and voting, these twin questions of land ownership and voting, become the real issues as far as what freedom is going to mean and what were some of the problems with freedom. If you remember, the introductory narrative to Chapter 11 is about Emancipation, who was a very aggressive, assertive African American. It's a very interesting discussion. Go back and read what Fortune is talking about. T. Thomas Fortune was his son. And years later, in the early 20th century, T. Thomas Fortune reflected on what had happened to African Americans in the aftermath of the Civil War. And he said, quote, basically, exclusion of blacks from land ownership and voting were the twin roots of the, quote, great social wrong, which has turned the beautiful flowers of freedom into thorns to prick the hands of black men in the South. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about how do blacks respond to this growing violence in the South, to the intimidation that we'll see in the next lecture, emerging in the South, restrictions on voting, even with the 15th Amendment, growing Jim Crow segregation, which you're looking at in the videotape. So you're seeing how it's developing in the videotape. For one group of people, or some blacks in the South, the solution was in migration. Migration emerged as a possibility, and migration not just to the West, but eventually also for people like Henry McNeil Turner, a return to Africa. Migration was seen as a way of getting out of the abusive situations that were existing in the South. Men like Henry Adams and Benjamin Pap Singleton advocated mass black migration from the South in the late 1870s and 1880s. And about 6,000 blacks left their homes in Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Tennessee to establish new homes in Kansas or Oklahoma. Once there, they farmed or worked as laborers. Women worked in the fields or cleaned houses. Or they took in washing as they had been doing in the South. In all, these exodusters, as they were called, homesteaded about 20,000 acres of land. They met prejudice, but not as extreme as in the South. They took Southern customs with them and achieved some level of self-government in the towns that they established, all black towns in many cases, like Boley, Langston, and Nicodemus in Kansas and Oklahoma. By 1900, 55,000 blacks in Oklahoma. There were 55,000 blacks in Oklahoma and the Indian Territories. And between 1890 and 1910, 25 black communities were founded in Oklahoma. Now, these communities faced problems of funding and attracting settlers settlers who brought money, because they were themselves very poor communities. And they faced other problems in terms of the attitudes of black leaders toward this whole idea of migration. Sojourner Truth, for example, favored the migrations. And she said, on reflecting on these migrations, quote, "The prison doors have opened and out the prisoners went." Frederick Douglass, on the other hand, saw the migrations as a mistake, and he felt that blacks should remain where they were, confront violence, and take a stand for equal rights. On page 278, you have a very interesting comment by Benjamin Pap Singleton, a response to this conflict or this contradiction of the statement that Frederick Douglass has made. And he says, or he said rather in 1881, "We don't want to leave the South. And just as soon as we have confidence in the South, I'm going to persuade every man to go back, because that is the best country. We love that country," meaning the South. "But by leaving, we're going to learn the South a lesson." So in effect, removal of black labor was seen as by Singleton as a way in which you could teach the South the value of black labor. Now, in Southern communities, or in the Southern states, you also saw the emergence of all black towns as blacks moved away from communities where they had faced all kinds of restrictions, political, social, and economic. And they created towns like Mount Bayou in Mississippi and Edenville in Florida. And by the end of the century, you had men like Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, who were even suggesting that this migration or this exodus should go further than just simply to the Western Territories, or further than just simply the creation of all black towns within racially segregated states. And Turner encouraged blacks to migrate to Africa. He traveled to Liberia. His efforts were supported by the American Colonization Society, which had been founded all the way back in the early 19th century. But there was not enough transportation available for the numbers of blacks who wanted to take this up. And by the late 19th century, the American Colonization Society itself was declining. Now, in the next lecture, we'll take a look at what kinds of other developments are occurring in the late 19th century as you begin to see the tightening of these restrictions on African Americans, the growth of Jim Crow and expansion of Jim Crow segregation, a form of slavery in many cases, but Jim Crow segregation, and tightening of restrictions on voting. I'd like for you to try to take a look at the videotape that I have assigned for this particular module before you go through the last lecture, because the last lecture will essentially be just kind of a review of the information that you have in the videotape.